Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm filming my September wrap up. So I don't feel like super well, but I am like 1 week into the month and I have not filmed this, and I don't want it to get even later than it already is, so I'm just kind of like power through this and hopefully you guys can like understand this nonsense. Okay, I finished 10 books this month, which is pretty average for me. It was a decent reading month. I don't know if I read like a favorite, but I did read some pretty good books and some surprising books. Anyways, so the first book I want to talk about was a carry-on from the previous month, and that is Warrior of the Wild by Trisha Levenseller. This is a YA, I believe it's a Viking-inspired fantasy. It's a standalone, and I really enjoyed this. I was kind of surprised by this because I've only read one Trisha Levenseller book before, The Daughter of the Pirate King, and I thought that was just like a very fun like fantasy pirate swashbuckling adventure. I wasn't like super like deep, but it was fine, and I kind of expected this to be that. I guess Trisha Levenseller just got so good with her characters. Like, she's progressed as a writer, which is great, but this book had a lot of like character depth and a lot of character exploration that I just was surprised by. I was getting very emotional during some parts. I listened to this on audiobook and I could just like imagine how this would play out as a film. For some reason, I think it just has that quality to it. But this book is about a young woman, and she is the daughter of like the village chief, and she's the only one of his children that like wants to be a warrior, that has the capabilities to eventually take over his position as like the clan chief or whatever. And at the beginning of the book, she's preparing to go through this trial, and if she fails the trial, then she gets exiled. If anyone fails this trial, they get exiled, and obviously she fails, and she kind of has to survive out in the wilderness by herself. The one caveat is that there is a task that she could like complete in order to get like accepted back into the clan, but these tasks that are given are pretty much like impossible, or like close to impossible, and that's kind of like the reason why they're given. It's not, no one actually expects people to like complete these tasks. The plot itself is kind of, similar. Like, we've seen plots of like YA characters having to go out on like an adventure to like prove themselves to their family, their friends, their people, so that's been done before. But I just really enjoyed this. I don't think I read a lot of Viking inspired stuff before, so it had really cool elements. There were like really cool like monsters. There wasn't like hard like magic elements, so if you don't like strict magic rules or anything like that within fantasy, then you don't have that here. So that's something, if you enjoy that. Yeah, I just kind of expected something very surface level, just like fun and chill, but there's a lot of like angst here that I really enjoyed. I can't remember, but I did write down in my notes that there is trigger warnings for sexual assault, so keep that in mind. It might have just been something said in passing. I don't think there's anything like on paper, but I wrote it down in my notes, so it's something that you will encounter, but to the extent of that, I don't remember anything too concrete. There's also a really good like sister relationship here that I really enjoyed. I've been finding a lot of like sister relationships that have been really good, so I love that. This was also a book that carried on from the previous month, and that is Something Strange and Deadly by Susan Dennard. This is Susan Dennard's debut novel. Susan Dennard is also the author of the Witchlands fantasy series, which I read the first book and really enjoyed. This unfortunately does read like a debut novel. This is a YA paranormal supernatural historical fiction novel. We follow a young woman named Eleanor. This takes place in Philadelphia. I'm not sure the exact time period. I want to say it's the late 1800s, judging by the behaviors that are exhibited. Eleanor has basically been left in charge of the family's estate. Her mother's kind of like in mourning, or has been in mourning since her father died, and her brother, who's older than her and should technically be in charge of like the family stuff because he's the only guy in the family, he's kind of off doing whatever he wants. But Eleanor's left in charge, puts a lot of pressure on her, admittedly. So her life is already hard, but in this world, the dead have started to rise from the graves from the local cemeteries, and that's obviously a bad thing for like everyone. Eleanor's brother has also kind of been missing. She's kind of been expecting him to return back to Philadelphia soon, but she hasn't gotten word from him. She hasn't gotten a letter from him, even though he kind of writes regularly. For some reason, she thinks that her brother's disappearance is also linked to the zombies, the dead supernatural elements, and so she seeks the help of a group of spirit hunters to like help solve the crime at hand. So this book is kind of dated. It's nothing spectacular. There's nothing like problematic or anything, but there have been better books published than this. I think for its time, I think it was published like 2010 or 2011. I do think Susan Dennard was like trying to do something new. I guess this would have been like at the midst of like the Twilight hype maybe, and this was just like a different paranormal supernatural direction. It's also set in a different like time period, so that would have been fun to read at the time. The bad guy in question, or whoever's like behind all of this, was pretty obvious from the get-go, and on top of that, the actual progression to get to that reveal wasn't great either. I saw this labeled on Goodreads as like horror just because of, I'm assuming, the zombie elements. It doesn't read like horror to me. It was just kind of like a supernatural paranormal crime mystery novel. It was a decent blend of like all these genres, but again, better stuff's been published. It wasn't bad, but maybe if you had read this at a time, you have nostalgia for it. I don't really care about this. I don't think I'm too eager to pick up the other two novels. I think this was a trilogy. There was one character that was really interesting to read about. It was a Chinese woman who was pretending, or who was cross-dressing as a man to like fit in as best as she could. Women weren't Chinese. I mean, Chinese people have always kind of been the target of like hate and bigotry in this country, but she's dressing up as a man because at least men were allowed into the country to do like labor work and stuff like that. And I'm not sure if this was like before or after the Chinese Exclusionary Act, but yeah, that would have been like an interesting character to read from. So after that, I picked up an audiobook from my library, and it was Romancing the Duke by Tessa Dare. This is the first book in the Castles Ever After series, something along those lines. This was a fine romance. I personally don't get super attached to like most like couples like in a book series. I know for a lot of people, when they find a couple that they really like, they like ride or die for them. Like they want to see them like succeed, and they want to see all the like cute like romantic angsty moments and all that. I don't usually get like super attached to couples, so I can't say that this romance was like lackluster. I always have like lackluster feelings to like 90% of the romances I read. That being said, we follow a woman named Izzy. I forgot what her actual name is, but she calls herself Izzy, and she is the daughter of a man who wrote these really like prolific kind of legendary like children's novels. Think like Narnia or Lord of the Rings type stories that are very famous. Izzy herself was technically a character in these novels. The premise of the story that her father wrote was that a man was telling his daughter Izzy these stories of like knights and princesses and like, evil knights and dragons and all this kind of stuff. Since Izzy herself was in the novels, or at least a character named Izzy was in the novels, people kind of like think of her as the character in the novels. So she's kind of like in this weird limbo where people kind of treat her like a child, but they also kind of like treat her like an actual character from the book. It's like really weird, but she gets like recognition from that, and she gets a lot of not like privileges in terms of like societal privileges, but people will do things for her. Like people will let her stay in their lodgings for free. People will give her like a free meal, and that's kind of like what gets her through, because she's kind of destitute right now. She has no access to her father's money and all that kind of important stuff. And then one day her godfather, who passes away, gives her like a giant castle. Unfortunately, the original owner of the castle didn't know that his castle was taken away from him and given to someone else, and now that person died, and now Izzy has it. So the question of like ownership of this castle is kind of what brings our characters together. Our leading man is a duke, obviously, and he's currently going through some personal issues. He has been blinded by something that happened. He's kind of like a Scrooge type character, and so when Izzy comes into his life, they don't really like hit it off very well, and that's kind of like the plot of this. I really liked our main character Izzy like as an individual. She didn't really go through like a huge change throughout the story, in my opinion. she kind of already knew like what she wanted in life, like from page 1, and I really like seeing that. Not every character has to go through a change if they're like confident and like sure of themselves, and that's what Izzy was. The one thing she wanted was like financial security, and she wants to be treated like a woman, and she wants to like be in a relationship as a woman, not like a young girl that everyone treats her like. And our main character has no idea of these like children's tales that her father written, so this was perfect for her. The one character who went through a lot of growth was our leading man. He's had some like huge troubles before the book even started, and like Izzy was the one to kind of like slap him into reality and like tell him like, yo, get over yourself. The really cool element I liked of this book was the kind of almost like fandom-y aspect that we kind of think about in like a modern sense was put into this like what era was this? I think this was a Regency era, so like this modern like fandom aspect that like we've seen at like Comic Cons and all these kind of like events put into this era is like really comical, and I really enjoyed it. There's like a whole group of like people who like live action role play like characters from her father's series, and they like treat her like a princess and like a queen, and it's really funny, and I really enjoyed reading that. It was kind of like, I don't know, it was like a nice nod to like fandom culture, which the book community kind of fits itself into in some corner of it. But yeah, it was just like a fun, decent romance. A lot of steamy scenes, so this is not like clean romance. There's like sex and stuff, but yeah, this was totally fine. If it sounds underwhelming from my point of view, that's probably just because, again, I don't get super attached to romances like as a concept as opposed to like characters. But if you are looking for something quirky and fun, this is totally fine and something that you might enjoy. So I also read the arc for The Trials of Colin by M.R. Carey. This is the second book in the Rampart trilogy. This is a post-apocalyptic trilogy set in England. In this world, a lot of things kind of contributed to like the downfall of humanity, but like the one thing that the publishers kind of like push is this idea that there's like killer trees and stuff like that, which aren't part of this book, but there's like a bunch of different things that kind of our characters kind of have to bypass here. In the first book, our main character lives in this very kind of small village. It's like 200 people, which is I guess an average size for most villages post-apocalypse. Something happens and he gets exiled from his community. In book 2, we have like a group of like ragtag characters kind of working towards a common goal, which I love. I know a lot of other people love that kind of trope. In this book, we got to see Mother Nature as like more of like an antagonist than the last book. In the last book, we got to see more so like people being the opposing force for our main character, but in this book we have like monsters, and yeah, it's really cool. I can't really talk about this book in so much detail because this is the sequel. This was definitely much more action-packed. In the last one, the author kind of really had to set the scene, or at least he wanted to really like go into detail of like the world that our main character Colin lives in. We got an additional POV in this story. Our main character Colin, once he gets kicked out of like his village, like he's gone, he hasn't gone back to his village so far in the story, but we did get a new character who still lives in the village, and like seeing like what has happened since Colin left and after he's done the things that he's done. So I thought that was really interesting, and I kind of enjoyed just seeing that perspective. That being said, even though I really like this POV, I'm not sure how much it adds to like the overall story that Colin's going through, because this series is very much framed as like the journey that Colin is going through is like super important, and super important to like humankind. I don't know how this like weird side quest or the side track that we're going on adds to that, if that makes sense. There's definitely less meandering in this book. There's definite like clear journey and like point A to point B to point C path that we see in this book. Again, in the last book there's a lot of like setting the scene, and also a lot of like, let's see what our characters do just like on a day-to-day basis type stuff in the first book. We don't have that here. I guess I kind of forgot, or maybe it was downplayed in the first book, or it was just like an offhand comment, but there's one character here who was in the last book, maybe not so much, but she was a huge character here. She's trans, she's a trans girl, and she's obviously not struggling with her identity. She knows for sure who she is, but obviously struggling with transitioning in the middle of a apocalypse, if that makes sense. But our main characters are very supportive of her and trying to like make the best of the situation. Obviously she doesn't have access to like hormone therapies and all this kind of stuff. This is post-apocalypse, and like it's not like she can just go see a doctor for her transitioning. There are definitely people who are transphobic, but there's just as much people who are very supportive of her. I have people mention, like in general, not specifically to this book, why things like bigotry are needed in a sci-fi fantasy novel when it could just be done away with. That would make sense if this wasn't Earth. Obviously some people did survive the apocalypse or the downfall of humanity, and they brought their ideas with them, just as much as some people survive the apocalypse and know that a trans person is not the end of the world. They are completely valid and normal in their own right. After that, I listened to Full Moon by Jim Butcher. This is the second book in the, Dresden Files. In the series, we follow a wizard detective named Harry Dresden, and he solves crimes. Not everyone takes him seriously. Some people don't believe in the supernatural, but some do. Each book in the series has its own crime that is investigated, so that's kind of like a general synopsis. This book was a struggle to get through for many reasons, but I'll start with the positives. I think these books can be very witty at times. I think the author can also really wrap up the story really well, especially when you have so many elements that are introduced. He manages to tie them all together fairly well. So overall, the reading experience is fun and like lighthearted, but there are just some things that really like stick out that are so frustrating to read, because there are so many like elements introduced to this one specific mystery. Some things did get lost on me. Characters, there's like 4 different types of werewolves that are introduced, and a lot of just things are thrown at you. And I was listening to the audiobook, and maybe if I had like the physical copy in front of me, I would have grasped things better, but that was just kind of like a lot. But we could just chalk that up to just like it being the audiobook and I need like a physical copy. Also, the women in this book are kind of whack. So maybe it's not necessarily the women, but just how our main character looks at women. He is a like self-described chivalrous. He thinks he is the most chivalrous. He thinks he is the most chivalrous man on the planet. And I'm glad that at least one person was like, you're actually a chauvinist. I'm so glad that someone realized this. So on some degree, I guess the author kind of realizes this, but at the same time, for someone who is so chivalrous, our main character just loves to look at women and their bodies and describe them in detail, especially in times where it's really not necessary. Like, let's say he's on a date and things are getting steamy, fine, talk about how beautiful she is. But sometimes he's literally being threatened within an inch of his life, and then he'll be like, wow, but her body, oh my god. And it's like, bro, I don't need to be told, wow, if only she wasn't killing me, like her legs are banging. Like, what? We need to cut that out. We don't need that right now. Like, the one main female character here was also pretty frustrating. She would have been like almost like a perfect like Mary Sue type character, except that she was being incredibly annoying. Okay, anyway, so my camera died. Let's pretend this is the quality at which we were at, though it's probably not. Either way, let's move on. I'm moving on. So okay, so I was talking about a female character in this book, and she was almost like a perfect female like Mary Sue type character. She's like badass, she's like sure of herself. If she wants to be like sexually explicit, like she can, because she's that girl. But she was very frustrating to read. The author purposely made her kind of like an obstacle for our main character, so she was like almost perfect in that regard. But anyways, the reason why she was so frustrating was because of this like one minor thing that kind of caused part of the plot to like go the way it did. And that's because this character Murphy goes up to Dresden and she's like, yo, we're gonna work together on this crime, this investigation. I need you to be like super honest with me 100%. You can't keep these supernatural secrets from me again, which is a very valid thing to say. And so Dresden's like, yeah, okay, fine, we'll work together, you're my partner. And then it just so happens that Dresden gets like a lead on this one suspect or whatever, and he like follows it by himself, which I wouldn't normally like defend him, but this was like a kind of opportunity that he had to take, and he just so happened to be alone. Like Murphy wasn't there, like next to him, glued to his side, so he follows the lead. And then almost immediately after like he kind of figures out what he figures out, like Murphy pops into the picture and is like, why didn't you tell me this? Like, you're keeping secrets from me again, what the fuck? And I'm like, okay, give him like a second to explain. And she like never gives him like a second to like explain his side of the story. She gets so pissed at him and like kind of like breaks the trust that they had built. And then not like immediately, but pretty soon she's kind of like, I think you're part of the plot. I think you're with the killer, or you're working with the killer. I think you're the killer. She basically suspects him of like being part of this crime, and he literally didn't know of this crime until she brought him in. Like, she called him at the very beginning of the book. It's like, hey, I need you. And he's like eating ramen noodles like alone in the dark because he's like broke, and he's like, yeah, of course, I'll help you out. And then she like ends up like arresting him midway through the book, and it's like, why? Other than like the actual like killer or like the bad guy of this book, like Murphy was like the antagonist for Dresden, and it was really frustrating because the reasons why she was like mad at him were kind of like a little like not justified. If either of them could just like take 5 seconds to like explain some things that went down, Dresden would have never had like not only like the bad guys on his tail, but like as well as like the police also kind of got involved and he became a suspect. It was like really bad, and it was really frustrating to listen to. So yeah, really good story, like fun, super fun story, but also kind of like has its issues. And I have heard that like the story really picks up pretty soon after this, and like the kind of female objectification of females kind of dies down later on in the later books. It's still really frustrating to read, and it's like, it's not even like a one-hand comment of like him being like, wow, she's so beautiful. It's like constant, like any female character is objectified and just like looked at like neck down. That's all he sees. So then I listened to Iron Kiss by Patricia Briggs. This is also a urban fantasy kind of mystery story. We follow our main character, Mercy. This is the third novel in the series. She's a half Native American woman. Her father was part of the Blackfeet Nation, and her mother was white, and she can transform into a coyote at will. This particular mystery involves the Fae people, and it's really fun and it's really cool. I've mentioned the series like many times, but in this world, certain supernatural races have kind of come out as existing, and we are seeing like the government and just like people in general kind of react to the existence of like werewolves and fae. The mystery here was really well done. There is some triggering stuff that happens in the later half of, or like not even the later half, but like the last quarter of the book. There's kind of some like sexual assault themes. But yeah, Mercy's a really good character. I really like the fae storyline here. This is probably one of my favorite like urban fantasy mystery type series currently right now. They're really fun to listen to, and they're really fast paced. So after that, I listened to One of Us Is Next by Karen M. McManus. This is the sequel novel to One of Us Is Lying, which is a YA mystery contemporary book. I really enjoyed the first book. This one didn't really meet those high expectations. The first book was really fun and enticing because it kind of started off with a murder. That's not really a spoiler. That's pretty much like in the synopsis. Someone dies in the first book. In this book, we are following how the community looks like after those events unfolded. And in this book, we start off not with a murder, but with like an app, like a person kind of starting drama like anonymously, and that's kind of like the starting point of the book. So I wasn't really like super invested. It was literally just someone like spilling secrets, like spilling the tea or whatever. And it wasn't like, again, because we start off with a murder in the first book, and this book is like high school drama, you know what I mean? Also, the first book, I really loved the characters that were introduced in the first book. I thought they were really well done, really believable, and well-rounded. They were very unique, but also relatable to like each other and to like the audience as well. And comparing the characters from the second book to the first book, not as great. They weren't bad by any means, but like the first round of characters were so, I don't know, I just really liked them, and I really attached to them. And this book, it was kind of like, they're fine, but they weren't as good. That being said, the mystery here was like a bit more layered, I think. Like there were a lot more dots to connect. It wasn't kind of this just like almost obvious crime, and it did kind of like pick up momentum, and like the things that were brought up were a little more serious. Eventually it became more than just like high school drama, so it does get better is what I'm saying. There were a lot of players part of this whole crime that occurred, but the one character that kind of like started off this motion of events, this like crime mystery that occurs, isn't like super involved with the story initially. And by that I mean, in the first book you knew like right then and there there's like a small set of characters that could be responsible for the murder, right? In this book you have a small-ish set of characters, and the person who kind of again was like the ringleader, kind of planned this all out, wasn't even in my wheelhouse for like 80% of the book. Like no one really likes to read a mystery thriller, and like the bad person was like that one neighbor who lives 4 houses down and gets like 2 lines throughout the entirety of the book until like the last few chapters, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, it's basically a stranger who does it, a stranger to the reader and a stranger to the characters. Like he kind of came out of nowhere, but whatever. I feel like this book was more predictable than the last one. I think the last one really kind of like caught me by surprise with like the big reveal, but for this one like the author was pretty obvious as to like who was involved, and it was just kind of like why like why would you do that? I don't know. So yeah, not my favorite. There's still some like good redeeming moments, but for the most part it was just like you could live without this book. This book wasn't really needed at all. If you've read the first one, you can stop there. You don't have to really continue on. So after that, I read Chosen Champion by Elise Kova. This is the second book in the Vortex Chronicle series. This is the sequel series to Air Awakens. Again, this is another series that I've talked about before. I wouldn't start reading Elise Kova with this series because she doesn't really explain a lot of like the magic in the world in this series. She explains that in the earlier series, Air Awakens. This is the second book, and the story really kind of like starts off here. I think the first one felt like a really long prologue. There's a lot more like action in terms of like plot points, like a lot more going through the motions of the story. There was a huge event, something that happened towards the end of the book that really emotionally grabbed me. I think that was one of the higher points of the book, but for the most part this entire series, because I've already read the majority of the third book already, the book after this series so far has kind of been a letdown because I binge read Air Awakens within a month, and I am kind of struggling to get through each installment of the series. I don't know what it is. I don't know, it's like lost its heart. We're kind of just going through the motions of like the day without kind of experiencing and like taking it all in. It's just kind of lackluster for me. But I will finish the series. I'm nearly done with the third book. I've talked about this series before on my channel, but this is about a crown princess who for political reasons hasn't been allowed to grow up with her family, and the part of the country that she's grown up in is like culturally and like religiously kind of separate from the rest of like the country. So yes, technically she was raised in the country that she's gonna eventually rule, but not by like a culture and a group of people that really respects the crown, if that makes sense. This has all been set into motion in the earlier series, Air Awakens. In this world, people have elemental abilities, air, fire, water, so on. And when our main character Vi is growing into her abilities, she finds out that the elements or the magic that she has is not like everyone else's. We also have like a chosen one type prophecies, that kind of fun stuff. That's kind of what the story is about. It's kind of vague. Again, it's a sequel series, but it's okay. So after that, I read a very surprising book, a book that I didn't expect to enjoy as much as I did, and that was Ash Princess by Lars Sebastian. The series is about a young girl named Theodosia, and our main character was the crown princess of her country. Her mother was the queen. However, an enemy kingdom eventually raided and invaded her country, took it over, and killed her mother. And she's one of the few of her people left alive. She's kind of almost like a political prisoner. She's also forced to like pretend that she's happy with this invasion. She's forced to like talk about her people and her country as if they were like savages and not well behaved and all this kind of bad stuff. And I believe the entire plot of the trilogy as a whole is to watch her get her country back. This was a really good start. I'm not sure if I would say this was like underrated, but I do think it's under talked about. This is a plot that has been done before. We've seen this young girl tries to get her country back narrative, so maybe that kind of dissuade people from picking it up because it's been there, done that. But I do think this was really fun. This book starts off with some pretty heavy stuff. Our character goes through a lot. There's character deaths. There's a very graphic like whipping scene. I guess that's kind of like body horror. Like, our character's country was invaded when she was 6 years old. I think she's like 16 going on 17 here, and there's a lot of like internal conflict that she's going through. Obviously she hates the fact that her country was like taken over, invaded, and she hates like the king and all that kind of stuff, but she has made connections with certain individuals that she can't just say they all deserve to die, because she has genuinely grown to care for certain people. So there is a lot of great character work here. There is a little bit of a love triangle that I'm not sure where the author is going with, but I do think that it's not inherently one-sided. I think, at least from the get-go, she does feel kind of conflicted as to where she should place her emotions. There's a book that was published recently called The Shadows Between Us by Trisha Levenseller as well, and there's this kind of like seduce the king narrative in that book, and there's kind of a little plot line going on here. So if that's something that you're looking for, this story has that seduction narrative. Our main character starts off the story kind of like waiting for someone to take her away. She obviously doesn't want to be here anymore. She doesn't want to be mistreated, but she's still like the symbol of rebellion for her people. Occasionally there is a little bit of an uprising, or someone kind of like stages a rebellion, and as punishment, our main character gets whipped for every attempt that is made to like overthrow the government or whatever. So she literally becomes like a symbol of rebellion with like the physical markings to prove that, and something kind of pushes her over the edge and like kind of wakes her up, because she has to realize now that even though she's still a young girl, like no one, you can't be treated like a child anymore. Like you don't have the privilege of having a childhood, unfortunately. And eventually we do kind of get some like Daenerys vibes later on, which I really enjoy. She's very angry, which is obviously like super understandable, and I love that. I need more like angry girl vibes, but like justified angry girl vibes. Like I don't want just like a girl to be pissed for the sake of being like edgy or whatever. Yeah, I really like this one, and I have the audiobook for the second one, so I'm really excited. And so the last book I finished in the month of September was Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is a really well-loved, hyped up adult fantasy. So when I do my wrap-ups, I don't really like giving star ratings, and like books like this are like the reason why. I mean, I do give star ratings like on like Goodreads, but I don't like giving star ratings when I'm giving like wrap-ups like this. Objectively, this is a good book. I do think this was well written. I think the story and like certain plot elements were really good, but for some reason this book overall just didn't like hit me in the same way like a 5-star book should hit me, or like how I should feel about it. So in this book, our main character Agnieszka has grown up in this village, and this village is like close to like the edge of the woods, which is called the Wood, and the woods are this like malevolent force that kind of just like wants destruction and wants to like kill people, and there's like one entity that is like preventing the woods from like taking over not only her town and her village, but like the country overall, and that is this wizard named the Dragon. And for his services, the dragon asks for one young woman to be given to him every 10 years as like payment. Our main character doesn't think that it's going to be her. She actually thinks it's going to be her best friend, because every woman that gets taken is like a very like special person, like charismatic. They just like have that it factor. And so our main character is like, that's obviously not going to be me. It's going to be my best friend, which sucks, but it is what it is. Turns out it's our main character. Obviously she's the one who gets taken by this sorcerer wizard character, and that's where our story starts. So something that I did really love about this book was that the woods, the wood malevolent force, I assumed was like a force of nature, like a metaphor for the force of nature, or like Mother Earth, whatever, was really well done and really well described. I don't feel scared when I read horror books, but the way the woods were described here was like eerie and creepy, and it actually legitimately like creeped me out. This isn't a horror novel by any means, but like that one element was really well done, and I really liked that part of the book. If you had read like the first 100 or so pages, you probably would have assumed that this book is going to be more of like a character study, kind of somewhat whimsy, but like it's not going to be a plot heavy story. I thought it was just going to be our character meeting this wizard character, maybe learning magic, finding out why he needs a woman every 10 years, which by the way, no one knows what he does to said woman for 10 years, so there's like a weird kind of like vibe, you know. However, at some point, maybe like halfway through, this book is like 430-ish pages, about halfway through, like an actual plot gets introduced, like with an actual like what we're gonna accomplish together type vibe that gets introduced, and it felt like a whole different story almost. The writing's still the same, but like I kind of wanted to keep that kind of just like whimsy character exploration, not plot heavy type vibe, because I think Naomi Novik's writing kind of like really adheres to that type of story as opposed to a more plot driven story. Not to say that the second half was bad because of this new plot introduction, but I don't know, I just didn't want that. This book also took me like 2.5 weeks to get through. I don't know why. I didn't feel the urge to like pick it back up whenever I did put it down. I mentioned that my favorite element of the story was this the wood type force, which I thought was just like something that was inherently bad, just the same way that like death is like something that's natural in the world that unfortunately everyone must go through. I thought the wood or the woods was something that like just happened, that just existed, but it turns out there's a purpose as to why the woods are like bad or whatever, which, because it kind of felt lame, you know. It felt like, let's give a reason why something is bad, something just can't be bad. Didn't really care for the explanation. It was a little too like whimsy fantastical for me, so yeah, that was also kind of a letdown. Again, this is like objectively a good book and a lot of people enjoy this, and I can see why, but just I don't know, I didn't love it as much as everyone else, which is really sad. So those are all the books I read in the month of September. Let me know if you love them, which you've read, any you've read, have you loved, have you disliked any of these, have I introduced you to new books? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to talk to me if you want to talk to me on my Bookstagram. I'm really active there. I post like almost daily. If not posting, I am like on my stories. I will link all my socials down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.